The Führer Bunker, Berlin, April 1945. Hitler's trembling hand clutched the outdated military maps as SS Brigade Führer Wilhelm Mohnke delivered the news. The Russians had taken Potsdam. Berlin was surrounded. In the damp, claustrophobic corridors beneath the Reich Chancellery, where the Nazi high command once dreamed of global conquest, only chaos remained. Machine gun fire crackled in the distance, and the thunder of artillery shook the walls. Hitler's eyes, sunken from a lack of sleep, darted across the room at Goebbels, whose previously impressive face now revealed a sliver of terror. The Soviet forces would reach the Chancellery within 24 hours. Ironically, as the Reich crumbled above ground, almost everyone but Hitler could see that his last days would be steeped in delusion, decay, and impending doom. April 16, 1945. The rumble of distant artillery began to pulse like a heartbeat beneath Berlin. At Silo Heights, over 3,200 Soviet Katyusha rocket launchers unleashed their deafening fury. 2.5 million Red Army soldiers surged westward in what would become the assault on Hitler's capital. Operation Berlin had begun. Operation Berlin was less a military assault than a cataclysm. At 3 a.m., the city's eastern horizon exploded in flame as over 9,000 Soviet artillery pieces unleashed a thunderous barrage across the Oder-Neisse front. In just 30 minutes, more shells fell than in Germany's entire French campaign of 1940. Waves of Stalin's tanks rolled forward through walls of white smoke, while loudspeakers blared psychological warfare, Soviet voices promising vengeance, surrender, or death. For the German defenders, many of them underaged Volkssturm or old men from the Wehrmacht's depleted rank, hell itself had arrived on their doorstep. The ground shook with such violence that seasoned veterans vomited from shock. It was a rolling apocalypse, unyielding, relentless, and lit by the fire of retribution. In the Führer bunker, dust sifted from the cracks in the bunker ceiling. The stale air, already thick with cigarette smoke, grew even heavier. In contrast with the opulence of the Eagle's Nest or his sprawling forested headquarters in East Prussia, the Spartan subterranean complex would be Hitler's last home. Buried beneath the gardens of the Reich Chancellery, the bunker itself was a claustrophobic labyrinth of reinforced concrete, designed to withstand the relentless bombardment of Berlin. Constructed in two phases, initially in 1936 and expanded in 1944, the complex comprised approximately 30 small rooms spread over 2 levels, with the lower Führer bunker situated about 28 feet underground. Its walls and ceilings, up to 13 feet thick, were intended to protect its occupants from the devastation above. Inside, narrow corridors connected sparse rooms, furnished with items salvaged from the Chancellery, including Hitler's modest study adorned with a portrait of Frederick the Great. Despite the presence of amenities like electricity, ventilation systems, and a telephone switchboard, the bunker was damp and oppressive, with pumps working incessantly to remove groundwater. As Soviet forces encircled the city, it became the epicenter of a crumbling regime. Adolf Hitler, frail and hunched, shuffled into the map room gripping a trembling pointer. His face twitched involuntarily, a symptom of both Parkinson's and the immense pressure crushing his psyche. These uncivilized brutes must not be allowed to swamp Europe. He fumed at the Soviets. I am the last bulwark against that danger. If there is any justice, we shall prevail. With that, the room grew silent and serious. Hitler declared, jabbing the map, believing that German forces could still encircle the Soviets. Those around the table, General Krebs, Wilhelm Buchdorf, Joseph Goebbels, exchanged glances but said nothing. SS officer and bunker commandant Wilhelm Mohnke believed the Führer was living in a fantasy. He was still talking about divisions that no longer existed. Still, he said nothing. Above ground, Berlin was beginning to dissolve into ruin. Civilians crowded into subway tunnels as apartment blocks collapsed under Soviet shell fire. But in the bunker, Hitler's warped sense of control still reigned. Eva Braun, the ever-loyal consort, poured champagne and made light conversation. Despite the shaking walls and the growing stench of unwashed bodies and damp cement, the mood that day was not yet total despair. It was tension masquerading as resolve. The staff still believed, or at least pretended to believe, that some miracle might come. But outside, Stalin's armies were less than 50 miles away. The trap had been sprung, and Berlin had become a city waiting to die. April 20th, 1945. At noon on April 20th, beneath a smoke-filled Berlin sky, Adolf Hitler marked his 56th birthday. Above ground, the Reich Chancellery Garden was a wreck, scarred by bomb blasts, littered with shrapnel, and veiled in smoke. But in a strange echo of pomp, an official ceremony was taking place. Hitler emerged from his underground refuge to decorate a handful of trembling Hitler Youth boys with the Iron Cross for their bravery in holding Soviet forces at bay. One of the boys, Alfred Zek, just 12 years old, had helped rescue wounded soldiers under fire. As Hitler shakily pinned the medal to his chest, witnesses noticed how badly the Führer's right hand trembled. His shoulders were stooped, and he dragged his left foot behind him slightly, a shell of a man who had once commanded the bulk of the European and Eurasian landmass. The ceremonial visit lasted barely minutes. When it was over, he descended again into the cement crypt from which he would never re-emerge. Back in the gloom of the bunker, what passed for a birthday celebration took place in the staircase room. Stenographers and secretaries had laid out coffee, cake, and a bottle of champagne. Everyone put on a pretense of celebration, but it was clear that the war was lost. Hitler sat stiffly at the table, barely touching his cake, occasionally murmuring about Wenck's army or Steiner's counterattack. The day also marked the last official reception Hitler would ever hold. High-ranking Nazis filtered into the bunker to pay their respects. Among them were Joseph and Magda Goebbels, loyal and fanatical to the end. Hermann Göring arrived radiating calculation. Also, there was Heinrich Himmler, whose loyalty was already slipping, even as he bowed and smiled. And Admiral Karl Donitz, freshly summoned from the north, sensed something larger unfolding but didn't yet grasp his role in it. Overseeing it all was Martin Bormann, the gatekeeper of Hitler's inner sanctum, who was quietly seeding his own escape plan. Outside, Soviet tanks breached Berlin's outer defenses. General Gotthard Heinrizi had already warned that the capital could not be held. Inside, Albert Bormann attempted one last attempt to get Hitler out of the city. There was still a route to the south, but it was closing fast. There was still time to take command of the southern armies. But Hitler refused, insisting he needed to bring things to a head here in Berlin or go under. Whether out of fatalism, delusion, or theatrical resolve, no one could tell. But his decision sealed more than his own fate. It condemned those still loyal to him to death. That night, under the codename Operation Seraglio, 10 aircraft departed Berlin's Gatow airfield, carrying favored members of Hitler's entourage to the Alpine Command Center near Berchtesgaden. Bormann had orchestrated it quietly, evacuating key figures and family members, but not Hitler himself. It was the beginning of the exodus of Nazi leadership, a silent betrayal masked as duty. As night fell and the concrete walls groaned with concussions from above, officers and adjutants began murmuring what had once been unthinkable: escape. The facade of discipline was cracking. They all knew the end was near. April 22nd and 23rd, 1945. On the morning of April 22nd, the illusion finally shattered. For days, Hitler had clung to the fantasy of General Steiner's counterattack, a maneuver he believed would miraculously push back the Soviet tide surging into Berlin. But when General Hans Krebs, the Army's chief of staff, reported that Steiner's forces could not be assembled, Hitler erupted. In the cramped conference room of the Führer bunker, beneath the flickering ceiling lamps and pall of cigarette smoke, he flew into a rage unlike any his staff had ever witnessed. Maps were swept from the tables, his voice cracked with fury and despair. "The war is lost!" he screamed, his eyes blazing with betrayal. "The generals have lied to me! They're cowards, traitors, failures, every last one of them!" Outside the door, Traudl Junge, Gerda Christian, and Fraulein Kruger sat frozen, overhearing the muffled outburst. When the doors opened, Hitler emerged hollow-eyed and gray. His limbs trembled. His face looked like wax. He ordered his stunned secretaries to get changed. A plane would fly them south and away from Berlin. But Eva Braun was already beside him, refusing to leave. In a moment that left the room breathless, Hitler kissed her on the mouth, a gesture so foreign to him it shocked even those closest to him. One by one, his staff refused to leave. Junge, Christian, Manziarli, they all stayed. Not out of loyalty to the cause, but something stranger: pity, guilt, inertia perhaps. Meanwhile, Martin Bormann activated plans for the evacuation of essential personnel. Julius Schaub, Hitler's long-serving aide, was ordered to destroy confidential documents. With tears in his eyes, he carried crates of papers up to the Chancellery Garden and burned the remnants of the regime in the open air. That same night, Hitler formally gathered his remaining officers and gave them a chilling announcement. It was over. Anyone who wanted to leave should go, but he was staying. And with that, the exodus began. High-ranking officials began fleeing the city. Staff cars were commandeered, planes hastily summoned. The bunker, once a hive of activity, grew quieter by the hour. In their place came the Goebbels family, 6 cheerful children who brought a strange warmth to the underground tomb, unaware that they were stepping into their own grave. Then came the ultimate betrayal. On April 23rd, Göring's telegram arrived from Berchtesgaden. It was polite, formal even. He reminded Hitler of the succession decree that granted him full powers if the Führer became incapacitated. With Berlin surrounded, Göring proposed taking control of Germany. Hitler's response was swift and venomous. Bormann drafted the reply Göring had committed high treason. He was to be arrested immediately. To those left in the bunker, the paranoia was now consuming. Himmler had made overtures to the Western Allies. Speer, once Hitler's friend, had stopped visiting. The faithful had vanished, each one rationalizing their departure while the man they once served disintegrated before their eyes. In the halls of the bunker, Hitler wandered aimlessly. He sat with his dogs. He listened to the ticking of the wall clock and the drone of the bombers above. For a brief moment, fresh air had lifted his spirits, until the next report of Soviet tanks crawling through Berlin's suburbs broke whatever calm had settled. In his private office, Hitler stared at the portrait of Frederick the Great. Then, shaking his head wearily, he whispered, "National Socialism is dead." April 24th and 25th, 1945. By April 24th, the trap had fully closed. Soviet forces completed the encirclement of Berlin, their artillery choking the city. The last surviving lines of communication between Hitler's bunker and the outside world were severed. The capital was now besieged from all sides, and the Führer bunker was at its heart. Inside, the mood grew darker, stranger. After Hitler's rage on the 22nd, something in him collapsed. Now he drifted through the corridors in a haze, listless, stooped, muttering about betrayal. The commanding tone that had once held entire nations in its grip had turned into rambling outbursts and delusional proclamations. He ordered imaginary divisions into action. He spoke of Wenck's army, advancing from the south to save Berlin, though those close to him knew that Wenck was retreating, not advancing. Despite this, Eva Braun, who had arrived days earlier, having snuck into the city despite the shelling, stayed near Hitler's side. She laughed with the secretaries, played with the Goebbels children, and brushed the dust from Hitler's uniform, scolding him for being unkempt. In the corridors of the bunker, the 6 Goebbels children played, unaware of the death that loomed. They drank chocolate with Uncle Führer, read fairy tales, and sang songs at bedtime. All the while, Russian tanks were leveling entire city blocks just miles away. Meanwhile, inside the bunker, hope clung to delusion. Among Berlin's last offenders, whispers swirled. Wenck's army was supposedly advancing from the south. For a fleeting moment, Hitler seemed to brighten. He roused himself from his stupor, looked at the map, and ordered Wenck to push into Berlin, a phantom counterattack from troops already in retreat. The bunker itself was beginning to crack. Artillery shells struck close enough to shake the walls. Chunks of the tunnel ceiling collapsed. A panicked guard burst in, claiming that the Russians are machine gunning the entrance. It was a false alarm, but it felt like a gruesome portent of things to come. The wounded were now everywhere, lining corridors, moaning on cots, being operated on in makeshift surgical rooms by overworked doctors. Supplies were running out. So were nerves. Junge and the other women slept in their clothes on mattresses in the conference room, listening to the muffled explosions above and the snores of Bormann, Krebs, and Bugdorf outside the door. And still they waited. For Wenck, for Steiner, for something, anything. Meals in the bunker had become a hollow ritual, eaten without flavor, without conversation, just grim silence broken by one topic: death. Braun insisted that she wanted a beautiful death, no blood. She discreetly revealed a brass cyanide capsule hidden inside the folds of her dress. After the final meal, Hitler quietly distributed the same capsules to the remaining secretaries, offering them with a strange, almost gentle apology. April 26th and 27th, 1945. By April 26th and 27th, 1945, only a tenuous wireless telephone link to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel remained, offering little strategic value. The much-anticipated relief from General Wenck's 12th Army and General Steiner's units failed to materialize, extinguishing any remaining hopes of a counteroffensive. Adolf Hitler, physically debilitated and emotionally drained, flitted between bouts of rage and periods of despondency. He acknowledged his inability to lead his troops in battle, citing his trembling hands and weakened state. Despite this, he refused to consider surrender or escape, fearing capture by the advancing Soviet forces. Within the bunker, the remaining staff grappled with the grim reality of their situation. Eva Braun, steadfast in her decision to stay with Hitler, began writing farewell letters and preparing for the inevitable. The discovery of SS General Hermann Fegelein, Eva Braun's brother-in-law, attempting to desert in civilian attire, further eroded morale. He would later be executed in the garden of the Reich Chancellery. As the end loomed, conversations among the bunker's occupants turned increasingly to methods of death. Cyanide capsules were distributed, and discussions about the most effective and painless means of death became commonplace. Amidst this, moments of forced normalcy persisted. A wedding between a kitchen maid and a driver was held. complete with a brief celebration offering a fleeting distraction from the surrounding devastation. April 28, 1945. The blow that broke Hitler did not come from outside the bunker, but from within his inner circle. Late in the evening of April 28th, Heinz Lorenz of the press office brought a piece of news that cut deeper than any artillery shell. A Reuters report picked up from a BBC broadcast confirmed that SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's most loyal lieutenant, was secretly negotiating surrender terms with the Western Allies. For years, Hitler had trusted Himmler implicitly, calling him the most loyal man I have. But now, as the report was read aloud, his face reportedly froze. The betrayal shattered what remained of his trust. Hitler even doubted the efficacy of the poison Himmler had supplied, suspecting a plot to drug and deliver him alive to the Soviets. To test it, he summoned Professor Haas to administer cyanide to his dog Blondie. When she collapsed instantly, he knew it would work. As bombs shook the walls and the Red Army closed in, less than 1.2 miles away, Hitler made his last strategic decision. He would die, and he would marry Eva Braun before he did. April 29, 1945. The last full day of Hitler's life began with ritual and performance. A wedding, a will, and a whispered goodbye to the Reich he once ruled with an iron fist. Hitler issued his political testament to Traudl Junge. In the empty conference room, she took it down in shorthand as he leaned over the table where once his generals had gathered to map his conquest of Europe. Now there were no maps, just accusations. Himmler and Göring were denounced as traitors. National Socialism was praised. One last fantasy government was named for a country already reduced to ashes. After a pause, Hitler dictated his private will, naming Eva as his wife and ordering that his body be burned after death. When Junge typed the documents, Hitler reviewed nothing, made no edits. There was no time. 3 couriers were selected: Zander, von Bülow, and Lorenz, tasked with escaping the Soviet siege to deliver his message to the world. Afterwards, in the narrow corridors of the Führer bunker, preparations were made for the marriage of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun. Uniforms were pressed. Champagne glasses were polished. The staff moved with practiced calm, aware that this was no celebration, but a curtain call. At noon, in the small room once used for military briefings, a civil registrar was summoned from the ruins above. Eva Braun and Hitler exchanged vows, flanked by Goebbels, Bormann, and a handful of others. Eva signed the register, beginning to write Braun, before correcting herself to Hitler. Guests toasted them with flat champagne. No one smiled. The bunker was divided into those who would flee and those who would die. Joseph Goebbels, devastated that Hitler had ordered him to escape and help lead the new government, refused to leave. Through tears, he insisted that he belonged by the Führer's side. Without him, he was nothing. He dictated his own testament, declaring that he, his wife, and their children would die alongside Hitler as a final gesture of loyalty. That evening, there was a muted reception. Eva laughed softly with the secretaries, the Goebbels children sang, a few officers drank. Outside, the Red Army had reached Potsdamer Platz. The Reich Chancellery was in flames. Then came the confirmation of Benito Mussolini's death, captured, executed, and strung up by his heels by meat hooks in the square in Milan. The images reached the bunker. Hitler looked at them in silence. The will, the wedding, the cremation orders. It had all been preparation. Tomorrow, the 1,000-year Reich would end with a pistol shot in a concrete bunker. April 30th, 1945. 0100 hours. In the dead of night, Adolf Hitler gathered his remaining generals one last time. The briefing was little more than a ritual now. There was no strategy, no hope of relief. The Red Army was within blocks. Hitler sat slumped, trembling. The once commanding voice now hoarse and thin. No new orders were issued. 0230. Afterward, Hitler began to say goodbye to select members of his staff. With a weary voice and glassy eyes, he shook hands and murmured parting words. Eva Braun, now officially Frau Hitler, remained by his side. Composed, graceful, already dressed in the black gown with the roses that he had always admired. 0400 hours. The bunker's last functioning radio and telephone lines crackled and died by dawn. All links to the world beyond Berlin were gone. Field Marshal Keitel could no longer be reached. There would be no escape, no negotiation. 0600. Hitler requested a simple breakfast, tea and dry bread. He thanked his cook, Constanza Manciarli, with quiet politeness. Those who saw him noted his stiffness, the way he dragged his feet as he walked, the vacant look behind his wire-rimmed glasses. 0830. General Hans Krebs gave one last briefing, confirming what everyone knew. The Soviets were on the doorstep of the Reich Chancellery. Hitler listened in silence, no longer offering comment or command. 1000 hours. Hitler summoned Krebs to his study. What was said remains unknown, but witnesses recall that it was brief and businesslike. There were no longer grand pronouncements, only last-minute confirmations. 12:30. In a familiar, almost surreal routine, Hitler dined with his secretaries, Traudl Junge and Gerda Christian, in the corridor. The tone was calm, the conversation shallow. With death hovering above them, no one touched their food. 1300 hours. After lunch, Hitler stepped into the hallway, leaning more heavily than ever on his valet, Heinz Linge. He shook hands with the staff, Junge, Christian, Manziarli, the adjutants, the guards. Eva embraced the women, her voice steady but soft. She wore perfume, her hair had been freshly styled. With a cracked voice and a faint smile, she urged them to get out of Berlin, to escape the horror that was about to descend on them. 1430. Hitler and Eva retired to his private quarters, now stripped of decoration. The heavy iron door closed behind them. It would not open again. A pistol and the cyanide capsule awaited each of them. Above ground, the sky over Berlin flickered with fire. The 1,000-year Reich had less than 60 more minutes to live. By mid-afternoon on April 30th, the deed was done. A muffled shot echoed through the bunker. Hitler was dead. Eva Braun had taken cyanide. Otto Gunsche, carrying out his final order, wrapped Hitler's corpse in a gray Wehrmacht blanket, then carried the two bodies up the narrow stairs to the bomb-blasted garden outside the Reich Chancellery. There, in a shallow shell crater under heavy fire, they poured gasoline over the corpses and set them alight, just as Hitler had demanded. Flames devoured what remained of the man who had set the world ablaze. By nightfall, only ashes remained. In the early hours of May 2nd, Soviet troops stormed the Reich Chancellery and discovered the charred remains of the Führer bunker. What they found was not a command center but a crypt, littered with maps, blood-stained furniture, empty cyanide vials, and bodies. Joseph Goebbels and his family, along with the generals Krebs and Bergdorf, lay dead. The war in Europe ended days later. The Third Reich, once declared eternal, had lasted just 12 years. Now go watch Hitler's plans for the USA if he won, or click on this video instead.